The knock was too sharp to be neighborly. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, opened the door, and there they were. Mason, my son, standing like he owned the place, and Jordan, his wife, wearing that syrupy smile I'd learned to distrust. "We know how much you make," Mason said. No greeting, no hug, just that. "You owe us." I blinked. "Excuse me." Jordan reached into her oversized tote and pulled out a printout, my property tax records, my investment account's name. Not the numbers, but enough to make my stomach twist. She tilted it toward me like it was a winning lottery ticket. "How did you get this?" I asked, my hand tightening on the doorframe. Mason shrugged like this was all so casual. "You used to brag about being good with money. It's time you used it for someone other than yourself." That word brag landed like a slap. I hadn't bragged. I'd survived. Worked overtime while raising him alone. Clipped coupons through every recession. Saved in silence while they lived like the world owed them comfort. I stepped back and held the door open. Not because I trusted them, but because I needed to know how far this would go. They settled onto my living room couch like they'd been invited. Mason stretched out. Jordan crossed her legs, eyeing my modest furniture like it was beneath her. "We're not here to fight," she said sweetly. "We just need some help. You're in a position to give." "And what is it you think I should give?" I asked already, knowing I wouldn't like the answer. Jordan leaned forward. $3,000 a month, just until Mason's student loans are gone, and maybe help with IVF. "You want grandkids, don't you?" Mason didn't look at me, just scanned the room like he was inventorying what might be his one day. I stood there, quiet, steady, trying to remember when my son stopped asking for love and started calculating return on investment. I needed to see what else they'd come for, so I nodded just once. "Stay for coffee," I said. "Let's talk." They sat at the kitchen table like guests who had forgotten they weren't invited. I poured coffee into the mugs I'd used since my first year after the divorce. Mason stared at the formica surface like it might stain him. Jordan tapped her nails against the rim of her cup, too impatient for someone asking for thousands. "This place is small," Mason said, his voice laced with judgment. "For someone sitting on a six-figure portfolio." I said nothing. The table they sat at I bought it secondhand with leftover rent money, while juggling 3 part-time jobs and hiding overdue notices under the sink. Jordan leaned forward, eyes bright with calculation. "We need $3,000 a month, just until we catch up." I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the words hang in the air. "Catch up on what?" She glanced at Mason, then down at her hands. "Student loans? IVF? A few bills." "A few bills." I kept my face neutral, but my stomach tightened. The last time Mason had called was 7 months ago when his car needed new brakes. Before that, it was his dog's surgery. They always arrived with a price tag. "I thought Mason's loans were consolidated," I said gently. Jordan shifted. "They were, but then he got laid off from the real estate job, and I've been focusing on fertility treatments. It's been hard." Mason finally spoke again, arms crossed. "You've always been good with money. You never needed help. We're just asking you to be there for us the way you were for yourself." I looked at him, this man I raised who once cried when he couldn't tie his shoes. Now he was here, calculating my worth, like a number on a ledger. I nodded, slowly. "So, you're behind on everything." Jordan gave a soft laugh. "Not everything. Just enough to need a little boost." I stood collecting my empty mug. "Let me grab something from the drawer." Their heads turned expectant. I opened it slowly, fingers brushing past old receipts and the envelope I hadn't shown anyone. "Not yet. I'll be right back," I said, forcing a calm smile. Bathroom. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears as I walked back toward the living room. Jordan sat on the couch, sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone like she hadn't moved. But Mason wasn't there. I stood still, listening. Then faintly from my bedroom came the soft creak of a drawer opening. I didn't call out. I didn't ask. I just walked in and found him standing at my dresser, my checkbook in hand, flipping through it like it belonged to him. His head snapped up when he saw me. "You shouldn't leave this lying around," he said, as if that made it okay. I didn't move. "Put it down." He hesitated, then placed it back, but not gently. "I was just curious," he added. "You've got enough. We just want a little help." I looked at the man I raised, standing in the room I built with my own hands, rifling through the remnants of my life like it was an open catalog. "What else did you open?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "Just your laptop. I wanted to see if you could afford it." "You didn't ask," I said quietly. "We didn't think you'd say yes," he replied, and the words cut deeper than I expected. I nodded slowly, the weight of everything suddenly heavier. I stood in the doorway, my hands still trembling from what I'd just seen. Mason's eyes were flat, calculating. Jordan's voice floated from the living room, asking if everything was okay. I walked back out and forced a smile, the same smile I used to wear at staff meetings when someone tried to take credit for my work. "You know what I said lightly? Why don't you both stay for dinner tomorrow night? I'll make something special." Jordan's head snapped up, surprised. Mason blinked clearly, not expecting that. "Dinner?" he repeated. "Yes," I said, keeping my tone warm. "Let's sit down properly, talk this through. Family should have a meal together, right?" Jordan looked at Mason, then smiled again, believing she'd won. "That would be lovely," she said. When the door closed behind them, the smile slid off my face like a mask. I reached for my phone and typed out a quick message to my lawyer. "Need to discuss urgent matter. Please call me first thing." Then I climbed up on the step stool in the hallway, pressed a small button on the smoke detector, and pulled out the tiny memory card. The camera had done its job. I slid the card into my laptop and hit play. Mason, rifling through my drawer. Jordan, typing on my keyboard, failing to guess my password. Evidence clean and clear. I copied every second onto a USB drive, labeling it with the date. The small stick sat cold and heavy in my palm. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about boundaries they'd crossed without a flicker of shame. I tucked the USB into my desk, closed the drawer, and locked it with a key I hadn't used in years. Then I leaned back in my chair, the tremor in my hands finally stilling. Tomorrow night, they would sit at my table thinking they'd cornered me. And that was exactly where I wanted them. The next evening, I roasted chicken with thyme and garlic, paired with squash and caramelized onions. The house smelled warm, inviting, familiar. I set the table with real cloth napkins and the good plates, the ones I usually reserved for holidays or grief. Mason and Jordan showed up 5 minutes late, just enough to pretend they were too busy to care. Jordan brought a cheap bottle of wine with a label she couldn't pronounce. Mason gave me a quick hug, too tight, too rehearsed. "You've really got this place fixed up," he said, eyeing the hardwood floors like he was already measuring them for carpet. Dinner began with small talk. I let them ramble. Jordan complained about gas prices. Mason grumbled about the system. I nodded, passed the squash, and waited. Halfway through the meal, as Jordan chewed and Mason refilled his glass, I stood up and walked to the sideboard. I returned with a plain manila folder and placed it next to my plate. "You asked for transparency," I said, meeting Mason's eyes. So I figured I'd return the favor. I opened the folder slowly. Their eyes tracked every motion. I slid the contents across the table, one by one. First, a printed still from the smoke detector camera, Mason, with my checkbook, his hand halfway through a drawer. Then another Jordan at my laptop, fingers frozen on the keys. Then a screenshot of login attempts from my bank portal. And finally, a scanned copy of the check Jordan had tried to write to herself using my name in shaky imitation. Jordan's fork hit the plate with a sharp clang. Mason's face turned crimson. "What? What is this?" Jordan stammered. I said nothing. I just looked at them. The silence stretched. "I trusted you," I said, finally, my voice level. But you saw me as a wallet, not a mother, not a person. Mason opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand. No, you need to hear this, because what came next would be the line they never saw coming. Mason slammed his palm on the table so hard the plates rattled. We're your family. We deserve this, he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain of anger and disbelief. Jordan's face twisted, the sweetness she wore like a mask now gone. I didn't raise my voice. I stood wiping my hands on a napkin and walked down the hallway without another word. Their footsteps followed Mason's heavier Jordan's quick and sharp. At the end of the hall hung the heavy beige curtain that hid my closet. I reached out and slid it aside, revealing the small safe embedded in the wall. I entered the code with steady fingers, the soft click of the lock echoing louder than their protests behind me. When the door swung open, I didn't pull out money or jewelry or anything they might have imagined. I pulled out a slim folder, the updated will I had signed just that morning. I turned and held it up. You were both in it, I said, calmly, meeting Mason's eyes. Not anymore. Jordan let out a sharp scream. You're manipulating us. You're using money to control us. I almost laughed, and yet I said evenly, I never touched your things. Can you say the same? Jordan's mouth opened and closed like she'd lost the script. Mason's shoulders sagged, the defiance in his posture leaking away. He glanced at the open safe, expecting to see stacks of cash, but there were only neatly labeled documents, a lifetime of quiet planning they had mistaken for hoarding. I built this life on sacrifice, I said softly, and I won't let you tear it apart because you think you're entitled to it. I closed the safe door, spun the lock, and slid the curtain back into place. Their eyes followed me as I walked past them and back toward the kitchen, where the remains of the meal still sat, cooling on the table untouched. I sat down, folded my hands, and waited for them to understand what I had just done, because the next step would leave no room for misunderstanding. By nightfall, I'd already called the locksmith. The man arrived in a van, worked quickly, and said nothing beyond the occasional ma'am and good evening. I appreciated that. Some things didn't need words. By the time he left, every key Mason and Jordan had ever copied was worthless. The next morning, I met with Helen, my lawyer. She didn't flinch when I slid the USB across her desk. She'd seen worse. But even she raised an eyebrow when she opened the folder and saw Jordan's forged check and Mason's face rifling through my drawer like it was his birthright. This is attempted financial fraud, she said calmly. You'd be well within your rights to file a no-contact order. I nodded once. File it. By noon, the papers were signed. By 4, they were delivered. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the same table they'd sat at, with smug smiles and shallow words, and I wrote Mason a letter. No greetings, no emotion, just the facts. I told him what he already knew, that I had trusted him, that I had believed at one point he might grow into the kind of man who built instead of stole. I told him this wasn't about money. It was about what he'd done to the one person who would have walked through fire for him. Then I tucked the letter into an envelope, slid in a printed copy of the footage from the smoke detector. On the last page, I wrote one final line by hand. You stole from the woman who raised you. That's the legacy you chose. I sealed it, walked it out to the mailbox, and raised the red flag. Inside, I stood in my quiet house and made a cup of coffee. No trembling hands, no second thoughts, just the calm that comes after you draw a line and decide never to cross it back again. The morning after I mailed the letter, I called my bank. The voice on the other end was polite but firm when I explained I needed every access point reviewed. No shared authorizations, no stored logins, no linked devices. Just me. By the end of the call, every account was locked down with new 2-factor authentication, tighter firewalls, and zero tolerance for just-in-case backups. Later that week, I was chopping vegetables when my phone buzzed. I wiped my hands and checked the screen. Security alert: attempted transfer of $10,000 from retirement fund. Blocked. I didn't flinch. I didn't curse or cry. I just sat down. Screenshotted the alert and forwarded it to Helen. Less than 10 minutes later, she replied, "Acknowledged. This constitutes escalation. Beginning formal investigation." I stared at the message a moment, then locked my phone and returned to the kitchen. The carrots still needed chopping. By Friday, Helen confirmed what we both knew: Mason and Jordan had used information they had no legal right to. Whether it was a stolen password, a cloned device, or another attempt to override my access, the audit would uncover it. They were no longer simply manipulative, they were criminally reckless. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. That weekend, I sat with a pen and a folder labeled Legacy. Not for Mason, not for Jordan. For the students I used to tutor when I worked nights during college. For the girl who had studied in a library until closing because her heat was shut off at home. For the version of myself who once believed no one saw her. I contacted a local nonprofit. "I'd like to fund a scholarship," I said, "for students who are trying and being ignored." They were stunned. Grateful. I promised a formal agreement within the month. I wasn't burning a bridge. I was rerouting the road, because if Mason and Jordan believed they were my only future, then they never really knew me at all. Weeks passed. No calls, no apologies. The silence from Mason and Jordan was louder than any outburst could have been. I didn't expect remorse, but a part of me, still foolish, still bruised, hoped for a moment of reckoning. It never came. Instead, I got a call from my cousin Cheryl. She hesitated before saying, "They're telling everyone you cut them off for no reason, that you just snapped one day." I didn't flinch. "Let them," I said. "The people who know me really know me won't believe it." She sighed. "Just thought you should know." I thanked her, hung up, and went back to prepping for the dinner that actually mattered. 3 young students were coming over, recipients of the scholarship I'd quietly launched under the radar. No press, no announcements. Just 3 envelopes delivered to 3 stunned applicants, followed by a private dinner invitation with no explanation beyond "I believe in you." They arrived, one by one. Nervous smiles, fresh clothes, shoes that had clearly seen better days, but had been scrubbed within an inch of their life. I served baked chicken rice and steamed vegetables. They said thank you, like it still felt strange to be offered something with no strings attached. They didn't ask for more, didn't hint at second rounds of funding or introductions to connections. They just ate, listened, shared their plans and their fears, engineering, nursing, social work. One of them teared up when I handed her a second-hand laptop I no longer used. "I've been writing essays on my phone," she whispered. That night, as I cleared their dishes, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. I didn't need Mason's apology. I didn't need Jordan's tears. Their absence wasn't a wound, it was a warning. And in that absence, I'd found something better: gratitude. Not the kind that's spoken to win favor, but the kind that comes quietly, sincerely, and expects nothing in return. When the door closed behind the last student, I turned off the porch light and smiled to myself. Let them lie. I'm too busy building truth. I finished updating the will for the final time. No more edits. No more second chances. Everything was now exactly where it belonged, clear, airtight, undeniable. The last page I slid into the envelope wasn't legal. It was personal. A letter. Addressed not to Mason, not to Jordan, but to someone I hadn't met yet, my future great-grandchild. The one who might one day hear 2 versions of the same story and wonder which was real. I wrote carefully, every word deliberate. Ask questions. Not everything you inherit is money, and not everyone who shares your name deserves your trust. I tucked the letter into the safe beside the documents. It rested beside photos of the diner I helped Dad save college essays I wrote under flickering lights, and the first $50 bill I ever earned cleaning houses at 13. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees scratched against the windows like they were trying to warn me of a coming storm, but I wasn't afraid. Inside, everything was quiet. Not empty, just peaceful. For months, I had left the door open. Emotionally, literally, symbolically. I had hoped Mason would walk through it with decency, that he'd remember who tucked him in when his fever wouldn't break, or who gave up nights and weekends to make sure his childhood didn't fall apart completely. But he hadn't walked through that door. He'd broken in through the window and tried to rob the place instead. They burned the house not with fire, but with something colder. Greed, entitlement, betrayal dressed up as family, and now the locks had changed. I sat down by the fireplace with a cup of coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands. In the silence, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt clarity. The kind you only earn when you survive the fire and rebuild on your own. The kind that says, I may have left the door open, but now I know exactly who stays on the outside.